Welcome back, everybody. We are here again as a part of our Securing the Season series to talk about the education sector. And we have one of my absolute favorite folks to talk to, one of the most insightful leaders that you're going to hear in this space um, anywhere on the web. Um, we'll let her introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Thanks for the kind words. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all here. And my name is Raluca Saceanu. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of SmartTech 247, and really looking forward to today's session.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So as we step into this, it's an interesting sector that we're going to talk about. It's one of those places that I think doesn't often get a ton of conversation around the space. And I think it's really important for us to talk about it as it builds a lot sort of from a governmental perspective, from an organizational perspective um, in the background of a society. I think it changes the way our culture sees cybersecurity. But I'd like to talk about sort of the threat landscape specifically. It's
Mhm.
really common to talk about threat landscape, but it's very rare actually for people to talk about it from an industry perspective. And I'd love to hear your thoughts of where the threat landscape is right now for education and sort of where it's going to in the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's timely as well because we're just wrapping up our 2025 threat report, which will be out soon. And there's a lot of interesting findings that I'm really looking forward to releasing. A notable find from the report that I can share today is that from a positive perspective, we've seen educational institutions have made significant progress in the last 12 months. They've ramped up their security investments. However, still about 65% of them still have gaps and still struggle with resource constraints, for example. So they can't find the staff, which is a common problem in this industry anyway. And it's easy to understand why they continue to be targeted too. You know, educational institutions have a lot of data, personal data, research data. This data is extremely valuable for cyber criminals. So the first motivation for them when they attack, for example, is to get their hands on that data. And this is a common trend from 2024, continued into 2025, and will continue in 2026 as well. And a common way for them to do that is, or to attack with ransomware, is, phishing. For example, phishing is a huge problem for this industry. Phishing now is starting to become a lot more popular as well, because they've realized that, old phishing techniques are ramped up by security controls. Human nature is still easy to target and to exploit. And of course, once they get in, they see vulnerable, outdated systems. And again, it's a problem that a lot of educational institutions have. And they may not all have the budgets to patch all their systems, buy new servers, buy new systems completely. So they still have to deal with legacy items. The problem that we see is that not all educational institutions have a lot of budget. If you think about primary schools, secondary schools, their budgets are incredibly limited. And we haven't seen a lot of progress in the last 12 months when it comes to that type of institutions. Another interesting insight from this year is that educational institutions have a lot of pressure on them. The IT directors, the CISOs, the IT staff have a lot of anxiety, a lot of burnout, which is common with other industries as well, but it's probably one of the highest instances that we see, except for maybe healthcare. There's a lot of pressure in healthcare institutions. So whenever there's an attack, whenever there's an incident, there's a lot of pressure that goes on them, and we've seen the after effects of these type of attacks are huge. So it's a new, let's say, trend that everyone is looking at the moment. And I think it's important to talk about the human aspect of cybersecurity as well, because there's a lot of pressure on these individuals to secure their organizations. And whenever there's an attack, that pressure just increases.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I have a question. So you mentioned there's a ton of pressure, there's resource constraints, there's finance constraints, there's a lot of issues with these organizations. And often these organizations are very disparate, right? They're spread
Mm.
wide, they have lots of different subunits. It can be a real challenge to find ways to reasonably secure them. So from your perspective, smart tech, they secure some of Ireland's and the UK's largest educational institutions all over the place. Um, so what are they doing really well? Those organizations that we work with, what are they doing that those other organizations can learn from?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm very happy to talk about some of our clients without, of course, mentioning the name, because they have invested significant amount of effort and time and budgets, of course, as well, to ramp up their security. And there are some examples that I'm just so proud to see how much they've matured in the last few years. So we are seeing a lot of positive movement. They know that there are targets. So many of them have begun in the last 12 to 24 months to modernize their security foundations. So what does that mean? They've looked at their identity controls. They've looked at their endpoints. They've looked at locking down those endpoints, which is a huge undertaking as well. Securing cloud, enhancing their anti-phishing and awareness controls, and of course, relying on our MDR and SOC to provide that 24/7 coverage that they need, and support on a 24/7 basis to identify the right type of or let's say to filter the right type of alerts, to act on incidents that matter, and to help them increase their posture. So they've done a huge amount of work in the last 2 years. And another positive change that we're seeing, and I'm particularly happy about, is that these institutions are taking their data controls seriously. They realize that the data is incredibly important to their operations. They face reputational damage if something happens to that data. So they're now classifying their data, they're putting measures around it, and they're just a lot more serious about risk management than in previous years.
How much do you think that push for foundational change has been driven by regulation? And how much of it do you think is sort of risk-based and they're just starting to sort of see it and make and mature on their own? Or how much of that do you think is actually sort of driven by regulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we've always had regulation, if you think about it, right? GDPR came in a few years ago, and then we've had other data privacy regulations. And what we're seeing in the last 12 months is probably a combination of both. The cyber criminals have seriously been targeting these educational institutions in the last 24 months, especially in the US. And we've seen the after effects of those. And it's a bit like a catch-22 to a certain degree. The more cyber attacks we see, the more regulations come in, resilience bills, privacy regulations. And then what we are seeing now is a faster adoption of security controls, perhaps maybe as an effect of these regulations, and also increased pressure from boards, because we're now seeing cybersecurity professionals sitting on boards and having that knowledge and asking the right questions. And, it's very difficult to turn on the TV and the news and not see a cyber attack. So whether that's a cyber attack on an educational institution or any other institution, I think it kind of does the job for that promotion. And coupled with the regulation, we're definitely seeing a much faster adoption. And look, the fines are serious as well. So GDPR, NIS2, and some of these other key regulations are driving a faster adoption.
So I have another question. You mentioned, and I love the way you put it. You said adoption of controls, and it's an interesting statement because I think it creates a separation that made me think, how much of what these organizations are doing do you think is an adoption of controls as a stopgap, and how much of it do you think is a strategic decision based on risk factors? Right? How much of this is like immediate attempts to fulfill a regulatory requirement, and how much of it is really sat down and considered and risk-based and
Mhm.
prioritized?
Very interesting question. I think if you look at the regulations from the past 12 months, regulators are trying to make things more well, easier to understand for organizations. They're giving frameworks, they're giving guidance. It used to be, for example, when GDPR came out, it was complex law, a lot of words, a lot of ambiguity. You can interpret it the way you want to a certain degree. What we're seeing nowadays is a lot clearer guidance in terms of regulations, a lot clearer guidance from the national cybersecurity centers as well. We're making things a bit easier to digest and understand. So what that means is that we're giving people methods and frameworks to adopt risk-based methodologies that actually make sense for their organizations. And I have seen, personally, I have seen a shift in terms of, in the last 5 years, for example. Again, I'm going to reference GDPR because it was a big one for everyone. When it came in, a lot of organizations didn't really understand it. They were scrambling. They wanted to get it done, make sure that, they're compliant. And even now, a lot of years after, we're still seeing gaps here and there. Whereas nowadays, it's very much driven by risks. People understand what the ultimate risk is. They're putting dollar values against those risks. They understand the operational impact that these organizations will face. And although it's not 100% there, we are seeing a lot more organizations adopting more risk-based methodologies.
It's fantastic. Thank you. Um, so I wanted to talk about, you brought up gaps, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit. A lot of organizations adopting controls, a lot of organizations improving their foundational skills. That's fantastic. What are the things as they're stepping into that they're really struggling with, that you're seeing from organizations, whether they're large educational entities or they're small educational entities? Where are the spaces that they're really struggling the most?
Well, if you think back at what we said, 10 minutes ago, attackers are now seeing universities and schools as high value because of the amount of data that they have. So some of the gaps that relate to protecting this high value target lies around complex networks, for example, legacy systems, a lot of unmanaged devices. And no matter how committed the IT team is, and usually they're small teams as well, certain structural challenges make defense extremely difficult because of the complexity that they have to deal with. And again, budgets, the smaller institutions simply do not have the budgets, and they can't, buy new servers. They can't buy new endpoint management solutions. Um, they may not be in a position to afford the 24/7. And also, it's really difficult to find the people to fulfill that gap as well. Nobody, wants to work 24/7 anymore, unless you're working for a cybersecurity organization. And it's very difficult for them to bridge that gap. And, when it comes to smaller organizations, some of the challenges they deal with are still relatively traditional in terms of security awareness, awareness around social engineering in general, poor endpoint controls. They don't know what devices they have. They can't control them. They can't put security measures around them. So that's a huge gap that criminals exploit.
It's really interesting. We've gotten to this stage where I think the technology controls around cybersecurity have become so rich and so varied. They're actually quite challenging to deal with. From a person who's done red team and worked with red teams all over the globe, it can be quite challenging. That being said, you brought up security awareness training, and I think it's one of those things that a lot of smaller entities should really lean heavily into. Let's
Hmm.
be honest, what is it, like 70% of all effective breaches start with phishing, right?
Yes.
It's the
Yep.
human entity almost every single time, no matter how good those tools are, no matter how varied and complex they become. It's actually still the humans, right? It's still the humans that are the challenge. And that's an interesting thing to look at. I think it's very easy to imagine that we don't have the budget for new tools. Training is something you can often get the budget for, right? Training is a very doable thing, and it really reduces your potential for risk by an enormous amount.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a bit, we talked about the smaller organizations quite a bit, and I wanted to talk about sort of the larger educational entities, the
Hmm.
ones who have dedicated CISOs. The CISO role is without a doubt one of the most dangerous roles on the globe, right? I think that the average lifespan is like 19 months now for a CISO, right? It's
Yep.
quite challenging. It's an incredibly difficult job. And it's so new that I think a lot of the understandings about what a CISO is and what they do is still not universal. And it varies deeply from organization to organization. You speak with CISOs on a daily basis all over the globe. When they sit down with the boards, what are education CISOs reporting up? What are they talking about to their boards at their level?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it sort of relates a little bit to what we were saying earlier on in terms of risk, because when the CISOs speak to, or CIOs, right, sit down with their boards, the message nowadays is a lot more grounded in real-time risk. So, they're showing boards the threats that they're facing, the type of incidents that they've had to deal with, or the Security Operations Center in the last month or 3 months. And they're also using intelligence to demonstrate how quickly these threats are being detected and contained. Sort of to give the board that comfort that, we're not perfect. We know we have threats, but this is how we're detecting them, and this is how fast we're containing them. They're also reporting on gaps, gaps that matter. So, for example, and again, back to what I was saying earlier, uh, boards have changed as well lately, and there usually is one person there that understands cyber, or I don't like to use this term technical language, even though CISOs shouldn't use technical language, but sometimes it's necessary because they need to show the board what kind of identity controls we have in place. For example, in our Security Operations Center, 70% of the threats that we investigate are identity related. So it's a really important topic for everyone at the moment. Um, they need to show what legacy systems pose unacceptable risks. Someone needs to evaluate those risks and evaluate the kind of mitigation criteria as well. And they also need to show, if we don't do this, this is how bad it can be. And in very simple, plain terms. The boards, they want clarity. They want to know what will have operational impact. So CISOs need to translate that cyber risk into business terms. So, for example, in the case of educational institutions, if we were facing a ransomware attack, it will disrupt admissions, it will disrupt research projects, it will disrupt our funding cycles, it's going to have a negative impact on our reputation. Perhaps we're, top 1% university in the world. All these things have to be clearly conveyed in terms of risk to the board. So, where we're seeing is that boards are asking for evidence these days. They're not asking for assumptions. You shouldn't go and make assumptions. Every time you speak to the board and you're showing data, you need to have clear evidence, clear metrics. Put dollar values against your risks so that they can understand if that's what the metric is, that they understand the most. It could be different for other organizations, but they will want to see metrics. They'll want to see time to respond, trends from the typical threat intelligence that you do, phishing metrics. Well, like one of the questions you're going to get from the board in the first 3 minutes of presenting is, how vulnerable are we to phishing? You need to be in a position to answer that question, because they will open the newspaper that day and they'll see a cyber attack that has happened, and it came in through a phishing email. So they're going to ask you that question. They'll want to see how you're securing data. And they'll want to understand as well, clearly what is the roadmap and what are the investments needed. And what we're seeing is that boards are typically a lot, they understand, right? They understand the requirement for budgets if you explain it clearly. Um, but look, it's not easy to report to the board. And I do think that there's an element of scaling up to do that, and getting the right metrics from your security partner as well, and getting them to support you with these metrics.
Fantastic. Thank you. I love that insight because it's one of those things that I don't think I get from a lot of people I speak to. Very few people speak at the level you speak very frequently. So I get the opportunity to hear stuff from your perspective that is things I don't get anywhere else, which I really appreciate. One of the things that I really like that you brought up was identity and access management, identity
Mhm.
being the center of things. Um, we've been hearing probably for the last 15 years of cybersecurity that X, Y, or Z is the new perimeter, right? It was the cloud is the new perimeter, data is the new perimeter, it's the mobile endpoint is the new perimeter. The truth is, I think as we look back on it, it may be identity that is the real new perimeter, right? From the perspective of how we
100%.
consider securing things, it may truly be the new perimeter, with the value of hindsight, right? Um, I wanted to ask, we only have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to ask, we talked about really large organizations. I want to talk about sort of smaller entities, those that have really limited budgets. They have a requirement to be open. They have a requirement to interface with the public. They have a requirement to interface with parents and teachers and students and so on and so forth. If they have three things that they need to focus on in the next year, what would those be? If you gave them three things to prioritize, what would those be?
From a cyber perspective.
From a cyber perspective, yes, of
Of
course.
course. Great question. Number one, cybersecurity awareness training, and sort of introspection. How aware is our staff? What can we do to help them identify these types of social engineering attacks, and to, very importantly, report them? So that's number one. Number two, seek support from experts. And for example, my advice would be, if you don't have the budgets, reach out to organizations who might be willing to do it pro bono. So, for example, we work with some schools in Ireland and in Romania on a pro bono basis, as part of our ESG program, to support them in understanding how to analyze the threat that they're facing, how to increase their awareness. We speak to kids, we speak to parents, we speak to teachers. Awareness is so important. So I would encourage them to reach out to these organizations, including us, and get support. If they feel like they're not getting the right tools, they don't have the right understanding, or for example, there's an excellent ad that came out a couple of weeks ago from the Data Protection Commission about how much parents are sharing online about their children. And I've seen that ad being reshared all over the world, which is fantastic to see. That's the kind of awareness we need to start bringing to the table as well. And, my advice would be, reach out to the experts, get that awareness up, and seek the support, especially if you're struggling with budget. And the number three would be to stay stay aware of what's going on, keep informed. If you're a leader in these organizations, you have a duty to protect these organizations from physical threats and digital threats. So it's really, really important that you familiarize yourself with the risks, you understand what's going on in the industry, and you stay informed.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We're actually about to go over time. We rarely do that, but I love asking questions. So I think we're going to call it for the day. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, and we'll see
Very
everybody
well.
next time.
Thanks, everyone.